There's a unique kind of silence that fills a boardroom right after you've spoken a truth nobody wants to hear. It's a cold, heavy quiet, the sound of careers being weighed and measured. I was a senior systems engineer, the person who understood the delicate heartbeat of our $2 billion production line. I saw a catastrophic failure coming and I raised the alarm. My chief operating officer looked at me from across the polished table and said the 6 words that changed everything. "You're a cog." Cogs don't think. He was wrong. This is the story of what happens when a single cog is removed and the entire machine grinds to a halt. So if you're watching this right now, maybe in your car, maybe on your lunch break, just tell me one thing. Where are you listening from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels, and if something in you recognizes something in this, stay with me. My name is Eleanor Vance, and for 8 years, I was a senior systems engineer at Sterling Manufacturing, a title that never quite captured what I actually did. My predecessors had left behind a patchwork of quick fixes and undocumented workarounds, so I had spent years painstakingly mapping the company's institutional memory. My role was never about a single component or one piece of code. It was about understanding the entire ecosystem. I saw the factory floor not as a collection of machines, but as a living organism, a delicate network of cause and effect where a single, misplaced decimal point in one system could weeks later cause a critical failure in another. I was the person who anticipated the echoes, the one who listened to the whispers of the machine before they became screams. And that organism was about to be given a new nervous system, a software overhaul, codenamed Project Velocity. This project was the personal crusade of Mr. Davies, our chief operating officer. It was his legacy project, the one he spoke about in every board meeting, his promised ticket to a legendary quarterly report. The meeting took place 3 months before the Great Silence fell, in a glass-walled conference room on the 19th floor. It was a sterile environment far removed from the heat and hum of the factory, filled with engineers who knew better but had learned to stay silent. Their eyes were fixed on their notepads as I began to speak. I explained that Project Velocity, while brilliant on paper, had a flaw that wasn't in the code itself, but in how it interacted with our older physical sensors. I tried to use a metaphor he would understand. The new software speaks a slightly different language than our legacy hardware, I said, keeping my voice steady and even. Individually, each sensor can adapt and translate, but under full load, when thousands of them are reporting at once, the network could begin to drop messages. A dropped message is a piece of reality that goes missing. It's a dangerous silence when we need a warning the most. I recommended a 1-week delay, a single week to run simulations and build a safer bridge between the old and the new. Davies didn't look at my data. He looked past me, out the window, at the city skyline, as if my words were an annoying buzz in the air. A week's delay would cost us $1.2 million in projected output, Eleanor. That is the only language the board understands. He then leaned forward, the expensive fabric of his suit not making a sound, and fixed me with a gaze devoid of curiosity. It was the moment he delivered the line that would become his legacy. "You're a cog. Cogs are meant to turn, not to think. We have a dozen people who can do your job. Just do as you're told." The room didn't get colder, but I felt a sudden, sharp clarity, the kind you feel just before a storm breaks. His words weren't an insult, they were data. It was the purest distillation of the company's philosophy. The parts are worthless, only the final output matters. I didn't argue, I simply held his gaze. Seeing that his words had no visible effect on me, he added one final instruction, his tone shifting to one of magnanimous dismissal. "I think you've been working too hard, getting lost in the details. I'm putting you on a 2-week mandatory leave, effective immediately. Use the time to reevaluate your role here." But I knew what it really was. It wasn't a vacation, it was the beginning of an erasure. The erasure began less than 12 hours later, a quiet, systematic dismantling of my professional existence. I didn't even have to go to the office to feel it. My key card, a simple piece of white plastic that held 8 years of my career within its magnetic strip, was deactivated overnight. The next morning, sitting in my car at the entrance gate, I held it against the sensor. The small indicator light, which had blinked green for me thousands of times, simply turned a flat, solid red. There was no alarm, no sound at all, just a silent, definitive rejection from the machine I helped maintain. I didn't try again. I just put the car in reverse and drove home, the morning traffic seeming strangely distant and unreal. Back in my home office, I opened my company-issued laptop. The screen that usually greeted me with a request for my password now displayed a single stark message. Your access to the network has been terminated by the administrator. It was efficient, absolute, and deeply impersonal. The digital door had been slammed shut and bolted. Later that afternoon, a call came from a number I recognized as belonging to the Human Resources Department. The voice on the other end was professionally gentle, a carefully calibrated tone that conveyed nothing but caution. She used words like realignment and restructuring of your role, phrases from a corporate lexicon designed to be both legally safe and completely meaningless. She said they would be in touch about the next steps regarding company property and final compensation. I didn't ask any questions. There was no point in asking for truth from someone whose only job was to read from a script. That evening, a notification from a professional networking site appeared on my personal phone. Sterling Manufacturing had a new job opening, Process Flow Coordinator. I read the list of responsibilities and a cold sense of understanding washed over me. They were my exact duties, a word-for-word copy of my own job description, from monitoring system diagnostics to developing risk mitigation protocols. But the title was a deliberate step down. The required experience was listed as 3 to 5 years, and the salary range was an insult, barely 2/3 of what I had been making. It was a clear message. The work you did was valuable, but you, the person with the experience to demand fair compensation for it, were overvalued and replaceable. The final piece of the puzzle arrived via a forwarded message from a trusted colleague. The message contained no text from him, only the forwarded company-wide email, a testament to the fear that now permeated the department. The announcement from Mr. Davies was cheerful and brief, stating that I had decided to pursue other opportunities and that they wished me the very best on my new journey. They had not only pushed me out, they had authored my departure, painting it as my own choice to avoid any questions. They were erasing the conflict, erasing my warning, erasing me. I read the email twice, then archived it. They had removed me from the present, but they had forgotten that my name was still etched onto hundreds of core process documents, the invisible architecture that held the entire operation together, an architecture they never bothered to formally document because they had me. And that was a problem they had yet to discover. The 2 weeks of my supposed mandatory leave passed in absolute silence. It was a strange, suspended state of existence. I organized my home office, caught up on my reading, and performed a deliberate mental decoupling from the identity I had held for 8 years. I did not once check my old company's internal news portal. I didn't have to. I knew that Mr. Davies, driven by his unwavering belief in deadlines over diligence, would push project velocity through the moment he felt my influence had faded. He would see the 2-week gap not as a period for reflection, but as a convenient buffer to ensure my warnings were forgotten. And I was right. On the Monday of the 3rd week, my colleague sent me a simple, one-line message. It's live. I didn't need to ask what it was. For a few days, I heard nothing more, and a small part of me began to wonder if my calculations had been wrong. But then the second message arrived. It spoke of a small, persistent error, a ghost in the machine that had no discernible source. On the production line, a specific sorting mechanism was misreading about 1 out of every 1,000 units, causing microscopic delays. 1 in 1,000 sounds like nothing, but in an operation that processes millions of units a day, nothing quickly adds up to a number that appears on a report, the kind of report that lands on Mr. Davies's desk. True to form, he had dismissed it in a team meeting as a minor teething issue that would resolve itself. The new engineer, the one hired to fill the role of process flow coordinator, was struggling. He was a bright kid, fresh out of a good school, but he operated entirely by the book, looking for official manuals to solve an unofficial problem. My colleague's next message was telling. The new guy keeps asking everyone where you kept your process manuals. He doesn't understand when we tell him there aren't any. The kid had apparently spent 2 full days trying to recalibrate the optical sensors according to the manufacturer's specifications, but the problem wasn't the hardware. It was the custom code that interpreted the hardware's data. He was trying to fix the eyes when the problem was in the brain. He couldn't grasp that the true manual was 8 years of experience, of learning the machine's personality, its quirks, its unique protests. It was a language, not a list of instructions. Then came the moment that confirmed their quiet desperation. My friend sent me a screenshot of an email sent by my replacement to the entire engineering team. The subject line was "Question regarding previous workflows." The email was polite, almost deferential. It asked if anyone happened to have a copy of any personal notes or informal guides left by Eleanor Vance that might help him troubleshoot the current sorting anomaly. My colleague added a single line of his own beneath the screenshot. That was 6 hours ago. Not a single person has replied. The shocking part was not the email itself, but the vast, echoing silence that followed. No one wanted their name associated with the ghost. They had started looking for my knowledge, but they were afraid to even speak my name. They had begun the hunt, not realizing they were hunting a phantom of their own creation. The hunt for my non-existent manuals yielded nothing, and so the small, rhythmic hiccup on the production line continued. A minor delay, when repeated millions of times, ceases to be minor. It becomes a drag, an invisible friction slowing the entire massive machine, creating a subtle, out-of-sync feeling that even the floor managers could sense, but not articulate. Within another week, that friction had a name: a 5% drop in overall production efficiency. In the world of sterling manufacturing, a 5% deviation was not a statistic. It was an emergency. It was a number that burned a hole in quarterly projections and demanded an explanation at the highest levels. The explanation, as reported to me by my colleague, was a masterclass in corporate deflection. Mr. Davies convened an emergency meeting not to find the root cause, but to assign blame. He spoke of unforeseen complications with legacy systems and the need for the team to synergize and enhance operational excellence. He announced mandatory weekend shifts for the entire engineering department, a classic management tactic of throwing more hours at a problem you refuse to understand. Throughout his speech, my name was never mentioned. I had become a nameless, faceless predecessor, the convenient ghost responsible for the legacy systems that were now failing them. But the problem with a system that produces physical goods for the outside world is that the consequences cannot be contained by internal memos. The most significant development came not from inside the factory, but from our largest client in Japan. Their quality control manager, a sharp and meticulous man named Mr. Sato, had a long-established professional relationship with me. For years, I had provided him with custom-formatted weekly reports that included a detailed risk analysis I had developed myself, a projection of potential failure points based on that week's performance. He once told me he used my projections to manage his own logistics chain more effectively. It was something I did to build trust, a value add that was not in my job description. Mr. Sato, noticing its absence for the third consecutive week, sent a polite but surgically precise email to my replacement. I received a forwarded copy late one night. The email inquired about the change in the report's format and, more pointedly, asked where the predictive risk analysis had gone. It was a simple question, but it carried immense weight. An email from Mr. Sato was not a customer service ticket. It was an event that would be escalated directly to the vice president of sales. It was an external party flagging a drop in quality, not of the product itself, but of the very data and intelligence that surrounded it. My colleague had added his own brief message to the forward. Now it's external. They can't hide it anymore. I didn't reply, but that email was the first concrete evidence that the chaos had begun to breach the factory walls. It was no longer just their problem. Mr. Sato's email, as I had predicted, acted as a catalyst. The internal pressure, which had been a low hum of anxiety, intensified into a roar of panic. The 5% drop in efficiency was no longer a teething issue to be dismissed. It was now Exhibit A in a formal inquiry from their most important client. The mandatory weekend shifts had yielded nothing but exhausted engineers and the same persistent error, which was now breeding new, smaller errors in its wake. The invisible friction on the system had grown, and the production numbers reflected this new reality. The drop was now a staggering 15%. This was the point where blame shifting was no longer a viable strategy. The engineering team, under the direct and unforgiving scrutiny of Mr. Davies, was forced to dig deeper. They began to realize the truth that I had known all along. The official operating manuals they were relying on were a piece of corporate fiction. They described a perfect theoretical system, not the real, breathing one that existed on the factory floor. The real system ran on a delicate balance of undocumented custom scripts, daily manual calibrations based on atmospheric conditions, and intuitive checks that I performed as a matter of professional habit. This was the institutional knowledge I had built over 8 years, a complex language of experience that the company had never bothered to ask me to translate because, to them, it was just my job. Their desperation led them to a logical, if futile, next step. My colleague informed me that a small team had been dispatched to the information technology department to retrieve my old workstation from storage. They had a desperate hope that I might have left behind some personal notes, some stray file that would offer them a clue. But the company, in its methodical erasure of my existence, had followed its own protocols perfectly. The workstation had been wiped clean the day after my resignation, its hard drive formatted and overwritten. The digital ghosts they were hunting had been professionally exorcised. The breaking point came during a crisis meeting late that week. My colleague recounted the scene to me afterward, his voice a mixture of awe and fear. The young engineer who had replaced me, after weeks of failed attempts and mounting pressure, finally stood up before Mr. Davies and the entire management team. He admitted that he had exhausted every documented procedure. He said, his voice shaking but clear, "I cannot fix this." The official schematics don't reflect the way this system was actually being operated. No one here knows the methods the predecessor used to keep it stable. That was the first time my existence had been officially acknowledged in a meeting since I left. But they didn't use my name. They called me the predecessor, a nameless phantom whose expertise was now the one missing key to their salvation. After the crisis meeting where my ghost was invoked, a logical person might expect a phone call. A tentative inquiry perhaps, a carefully worded offer for a consulting contract. I expected it myself, not out of ego, but because it was the most rational move on their chessboard. But the leadership at Sterling Manufacturing I was coming to fully appreciate was not operating on logic. They were operating on fear, and fear rarely makes rational decisions. The move they made next was not one of reconciliation, but of aggression. It did not arrive as a phone call, but as a stiff, cream-colored envelope delivered by a courier. The letterhead was not from my old company, but from a powerful, notoriously aggressive law firm that specialized in corporate litigation. The paper felt heavy in my hands, its texture designed to communicate importance and intimidation. The language inside was a carefully constructed web of legal threats, all wrapped in polite, professional phrasing. It began by reminding me of the non-disclosure agreement I had signed upon my hiring 8 years prior, citing specific clauses about confidentiality and the protection of company secrets. Then came the core of the message. The letter formally requested, or rather demanded, that I immediately return any and all company property still in my possession. It went on to define property in the broadest possible terms, including, but not limited to, any proprietary data, process notes or documents, whether they existed in physical or digital form. The implication was clear. Hanging between the lines of dense legal text, they were accusing me of theft. They were building a narrative that I had maliciously withheld vital information, that I was the saboteur, not them. I read the letter twice, not with anger or fear, but with a kind of clinical fascination. This wasn't a request for help, it was a preemptive strike. They were terrified that when the inevitable investigation began, I would be called to testify. They were trying to legally gag me, to discredit me before I could even speak. The ultimate irony, of course, was that the intellectual property they were accusing me of stealing was the very knowledge they were now desperate to recover. They were threatening to sue me for possessing the memories and experience that they had paid me to develop for nearly a decade. The letter was a confession of their dependence, disguised as an accusation. I placed the letter on my desk, its weight seeming to anchor the silence in the room. I did not draft a reply. I did not call Mr. Davies to argue. I simply walked over to my scanner, placed the letter on the glass, and created a clean digital copy. Then I attached it to a new email, addressed to a lawyer I had put on retainer a week ago for just such a contingency. The subject line I typed was only 3 words long. For the record. My lawyer acknowledged receipt of the legal letter with a simple confirmation. After that, a new kind of quiet settled in. It was the tense, waiting silence of a chess match after a bold and foolish move has been made. I knew my old company's strategy. They would attempt to patch the system with brute force and overtime, while their legal team sharpened its knives in the background, preparing to paint me as the villain. They were trying to solve a problem of engineering with a strategy of intimidation, and I knew it was doomed to fail. I simply had to wait for physics and logic to run their inevitable course. The wait was not long. About a week later, my phone rang. It was my colleague, but his voice was different this time. The usual nervousness was gone, replaced by a raw, breathless panic. "It's happening, Eleanor," he said, his words tumbling out over the sound of distant alarms in the background. "It's the cascade failure. It's exactly what you said would happen." He didn't have to explain. I could picture it perfectly in my mind as he spoke, the digital dominoes toppling one by one. The constant small errors from the sorting mechanism had put a sustained, unrecognized strain on the central processing unit. The system, trying to correct thousands of tiny flaws every minute, had become overwhelmed. It was the translator in the crowded room I had warned them about, and it had finally broken down. The network didn't just drop messages anymore, it began to corrupt them. The delicate sensors that monitored temperature, pressure, and chemical composition were now screaming warnings, but the system was hearing gibberish, or worse, nothing at all. A critical sensor array, starved of correct information, miscalibrated itself by a fatal margin. For 6 hours, the line continued to run, a ghost operating with a broken mind, churning out a product that was perfect on the surface but fundamentally flawed within. 6 hours of worthless, unsalvageable product, representing tens of millions of dollars in loss. And then, the system's final, deepest layer of self-preservation kicked in. The emergency shutdown protocol, a program that had not been activated in over a decade, initiated a total system halt. The alarms my colleague had heard were the final gasp. Then, he said, there was only silence. The great constant hum of the $2 billion production line, the very heartbeat of the company, had stopped. The machine was no longer breathing. The news of the shutdown traveled faster than any internal email. Before my colleague had even hung up, a notification lit up my phone from a financial news service. The headline, stark and unforgiving: "Major disruption halts production at Sterling Manufacturing." I stared at the headline on my phone, the cold black letters forming a stark epitaph for a crisis I had foretold. The problem was no longer an internal memo or a concerned client's email. It was now a public fact, a bleeding wound on the open market for all the world to see. In that moment, the power dynamic of the entire situation shifted, a silent, seismic event that I felt in the stillness of my home office. I knew a call was coming. The only question was how long it would take for their desperation to overcome their pride. It took less than an hour. My phone rang, the caller identification showing the main switchboard number for Sterling Manufacturing. I let it ring 3 times before answering, a small, deliberate act of control. I said nothing. The silence stretched for a moment before a voice I recognized crackled on the other end. It was Mr. Davies, but it was not the same man I had faced in the boardroom. The arrogant, commanding tone was gone, replaced by a thin, strained version of itself, the sound of a man trying to project authority while drowning. He didn't bother with greetings. He launched directly into a panicked monologue, the words tumbling over one another in a frantic search for purchase. He spoke of the board convening an emergency session, of the stock price entering free fall in after-hours trading, of furious calls from clients and investors. It was a verbal torrent of consequence, the raw output of a man watching his career disintegrate in real time. I listened patiently, my silence a stark contrast to his spiraling panic. I was a blank wall against which his desperation was crashing. He wasn't speaking to me so much as at me, using me as a receptacle for the failure he could not bring himself to own. And then, after venting his own terror, he finally arrived at the purpose of his call. He needed a target for his blame. His voice shifted, attempting to find its old, familiar tone of command. "I don't know what kind of backdoor you built into the system before you left, Eleanor," he said, his voice dripping with accusation. "I don't know what you did, but the board is demanding answers in 30 minutes and you are going to tell me how to fix it. Right now." The audacity of it was breathtaking. Even now, with the entire machine in ruins around him, his first and only instinct was to point the finger, to rewrite history with me as the saboteur. He wasn't asking for help. He was delivering a threat, based on a fantasy where he was still in control. A long moment of silence passed between us, a quiet space where I held all the power by simply refusing to fill it with a response. His desperate strategy was now perfectly clear. The silence that followed his accusation stretched across the phone line, thick with his ragged breathing and my own deliberate calm. In that moment, I could see the entire arc of his decision-making with perfect clarity. He hadn't called me for a solution. He had called me for an alibi, a scapegoat he could offer up to the board of directors. He wasn't looking for a path forward. He was looking for a person to blame for the dead end he had created. I let the silence hang in the air for a few moments longer, allowing him to fully experience the weight of his own powerlessness. When I finally spoke, my voice was low, even, and completely devoid of the panic that laced his own. "Mr. Davies," I began, my tone as neutral as if I were reading a weather report. "I am listening to you, and I have to refer back to the last piece of professional advice you gave me." I paused, letting him process that. "As you made perfectly clear in our last meeting, I was just a cog, a replaceable part whose job was not to think, but to turn." His breath hitched on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his mind as he realized his own words were being turned back on him, not as an insult, but as a statement of fact. "Cogs don't have the schematics for the entire machine, Mr. Davies," I continued, my voice unwavering. "They don't understand the complexities of a system they were never meant to comprehend. They only perform their simple function. And since my function at Sterling Manufacturing has been terminated, I'm afraid I can no longer be of service to you. I no longer work there." Before he could form a reply, before another threat or plea could leave his lips, I ended the call. The simple act of my thumb pressing a button on the screen felt definitive, a quiet punctuation mark at the end of a long and poorly written sentence. The ensuing silence in my home office was not empty. It felt clean, orderly. I turned to my personal computer, the one the company had no access to, and navigated to a simple password-protected folder. Inside was a meticulous archive of my 8 years at the company. Every weekly performance report, every risk analysis, every email in which I had flagged the potential dangers of Project Velocity. They were all there, time-stamped and saved. They didn't need me to fix the machine. They needed the truth of why it broke. And I knew that the documented truth, which now rested securely in my possession, was far more dangerous to them than a silent production line. In the weeks that followed, I watched from a distance as the consequences unfolded in the business press. Their stock price settled at a bruised new low. Then one morning, I saw the small article I had been expecting. Mr. Davies was stepping down to pursue other opportunities, the universal corporate euphemism for a forced resignation. There was no satisfaction in reading it, only the quiet affirmation of an unavoidable outcome. He was a man who saw people as numbers on a spreadsheet, and he had finally become one himself. That same afternoon, a call came from a New York area code. The voice was that of a top executive recruiter, polished and direct. "Ms. Vance," she said, "the industry is small and word gets around. It seems to us that Sterling Manufacturing failed to understand that the most valuable component of a complex system isn't always listed on an asset sheet." It was the most profound validation I could imagine, delivered not with sympathy, but with the crisp respect of a fellow professional. She said she was representing a direct competitor, a company known for its innovation, and they were creating a new role specifically with my profile in mind. Head of Systems Integrity, the compensation she mentioned was nearly double my previous salary. A slow smile spread across my face as I listened, looking out my window at the quiet, orderly world outside. Mr. Davies had called me a cog. He never understood the fundamental truth. The person who truly understands the entire machine isn't just another cog. They are the operator. And for the first time, I felt ready to take the controls. This journey taught me that silence isn't weakness. It's the space where consequences are allowed to grow. True power isn't about having the loudest voice in the room, but about understanding the system so well that your absence creates an undeniable void. If you have ever been made to feel like a replaceable part, or have had to quietly walk away from a place that no longer valued your contribution, know that you are not alone. If this story spoke to you, comment and share it with someone who's still finding their own voice.